main action was in the South, so I headed first to Georgia and then to Mississippi. The civil rights movement would enhance my consciousness as a Jew, as it would turn out. In Mississippi, blacks generally, and black and white civil rights workers in particular, faced unbelievable danger, jailings, beatings, economic reprisals, and sometimes death. I attended church services many Sundays in the black communities in which I was privileged to live. It was the only place a Mississippi black man could wear a suit and tie, and a Mississippi black woman a dress and hose, and address each other as sister and brother. If religion was an opiate, and it also was an anchor, a refuge. So I decided to find out who I was as a Jew. I became offended by many progressive Jews I knew who were well-versed in African-American history, as well they should be, yet knew so little of their own people. For several years, I had been reading Jewish Currents magazine and works by Nathan Oswald and Morris Shappies. I knew Morris. Morris bounced my oldest son on his knee at his magazine's office in Union Square in New York, and my boy is now 51. I began my religious inquiry by reading the Hebrew Bible, skipping only the this one begat that one, and focusing on, for example, Deuteronomy. I command thee, saying, thou shalt open thine hand wide unto thy brother and sister, to thy poor, to thy needy in the land. I added the word sister to the quote, and that's another tale. Culture became for me not just technique, sensuousness, and aesthetics. I could not enjoy culture when it was connected to torture. No art for art's sake for me. For example, during the Nazi period, Ilse Koch designed very pretty lampshades. Could the fact that they were made from the skins of murdered Jews inhibit one's enjoyment? Nor can I forget the beautiful parks I visited in Israel in 6 trips over many years, built on land once peopled by my Palestinian cousins. Returning to Mississippi. This is why I'll never be an organizer. Well, returning to Mississippi, Vernon Dahmer, leader of the NAACP in Hattiesburg in the 1960s, went on the radio to urge his people to register and vote. A minister from the Delta Ministry of the National Council of Churches and I went to visit Mr. Dahmer. Mr. Dahmer gave us a sign which had been affixed to a tree near his house, and now I can't find the sign. Well, there's a copy of the sign there. The original sign is in the archives at the University of Southern Mississippi Library. The sign pictures a large Klansman in a white robe pointing at you with the slogan, I want you in the white knights of the Mississippi Ku Klux Klan. 6 months, Dahmer was dead. The Klan had hurled a firebomb into his home, burning him over 80% of his body. One of my daughters was named after him. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel became a real scholar to me when he marched alongside Reverend Martin Luther King, as much for marching as for his 2-volume work on the prophets. The Jewish proletarian poets of the turn of the 20th century turned me on. Listen to Morris Rosenfeld. Don't look for me where myrtles bloom. You won't find me there, my love. By the machines where lives wither, there you'll find my place of rest. Emma Lazarus also was a big influence on me. The religion of my people became but one aspect of my understanding of the relationship of economic base to superstructure, which led me to try to understand the question of questions. Did Jews meekly march to the ovens, to the gas ovens, Sidorim in hand during the Holocaust? Yuri Sewell's magnificent book, Be Fought Back, in the shtetls, the ghettos of Nazi-occupied Europe, even in Berlin. Also as participants from the U.S. in the Abraham Brigade and the 7,000 volunteers in the 5 international brigades from all over the world, fighting to prevent Spain from becoming the dress rehearsal for World War II. I learned most particularly that culture and religion are reflections of the historical moment, that there are those who accommodate and those who resist, that I have more in common with Kevin Barry, the Irish patriot who resisted the British and paid with his life, than with those Jews who collaborated with the fascists. As well, the Sheldon Edelsteins and those who are trying, as we speak, to sanitize Bernie Madoff, the big pharma vampires, and others. I also learned I share a bond with Monsignor Angelo Roncalli, later to become Pope John the 23rd, who helped rescue tens of thousands of Jews. We are our sister and brother's keeper. The life of a Palestinian fighting for a homeland must be as sacred and revered as that of a Jew. Please let me describe a religious experience of mine that occurred in Jackson, Mississippi, where 950 of us were arrested in one of the largest mass jailings of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. I was in the first wave of those arrested. We were protesting the illegal convening of the Mississippi State Legislature, illegal because of the disfranchisement of its black citizens. We arrived in prison trucks at the state fairgrounds where cattle had been kept and then moved, and which were the same buildings where we would be housed. Women and men were separated, and I didn't see my jailed sisters in the struggle until we were released on bond about 2 weeks later. I heard that a pregnant black female prisoner was beaten and suffered a miscarriage. After being booked, we had to pass through a cordon of Mississippi State Police. Some of us were beaten. In the cavernous hall where we wound up, there were additional beatings for protesting the cops segregating us. Black civil rights protesters on one side, facing whites on the other. When dinner was to be served, the guards, as a form of control and humiliation, forced the whites to line up first. Each white inmate was given a slice of bologna stuck between 2 stale pieces of bread and a paper cup with milk, or rather water with a little milk powder. Each white guy returned with his meal to his spot on the cement floor on the white side, sat down cross-legged, and placed the cup on the floor, sandwich on top of the cup in front of him. Then the African-American civil rights prisoners lined up to get sandwich and milk. They returned to their spots on the colored side, sat down cross-legged, placing cup on hard cement floor and sandwich atop. No one ate. No one drank. After the last black prisoner took his seat, all of us prisoners, black and white together, and without prearrangement, picked up our sandwiches and broke bread as one. Were I a Catholic, I would have thought of Holy Communion. But I am a Jew, so I must relate this to the Jewish culture and religion of this secular Jew, in Psalm 91, which I will make gender neutral. I am with those in distress. I will release them, and I will honor them. As to the present, an op-ed from JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, dated July 16, 2015. For Black Orthodox Jews, constant racism is exhausting. It was written by Chava Shervington, maybe Chava Shervington, president of the Jewish Multiracial Network. And I quote, "When I was 24, an Orthodox matchmaker tried to set me up on a date. When I objected, she told me, 'Stop being so picky. Not many guys are willing to consider a black girl.' As an African-American Orthodox Jew, this was hardly my first encounter with the questionable treatment I and my fellow Jews of color endure." Continuing the quote. At one yeshiva in Brooklyn, the mother of a biracial student was asked to stay away from the school because it made the other parents uncomfortable. An African-American acquaintance told me to
God
You
damn
all
it!
heard
Why
a
does it keep
worshiper at
crashing?
Morning
Sorry.
Minyan talking about how he didn't want to daven with a schwarzer, while my acquaintance was putting on his tefillin. End quote. The word schwarzer simply means black, but its intonation can be everyday wording or racist. My mother used it both ways. Israel is proportionately the most COVID vaccinated country, but only if you are Jewish. Are Palestinians or African Americans? In Israel and the US, either we will live together or we will die together. Power to the people. No pasaran.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ira. Cheryl, handing it over to you now.
Great. Thank you both, and actually thank all three of you. It's really an honor to be with three heroes at the same time, and I'm really grateful to be here. My job is to interview you both, but I wanted to focus on three things that I think you all raised, and see if we can push it a little bit further. The first is we talk about the Black-Jewish relationship, which we've all acknowledged is a Black-white Jewish relationship, because after all, Black Jews have their own relationship with Blackness, right? So the Black-Jewish relationship that we talk about, I would like to contrast that, or at least compare that to the relationship on the ground. Is what we now think of as the Black-white Jewish relationship, how did that manifest itself in actual life? And you both spoke to that a little bit, but I want to go a little further. The second issue that I think you raised that's really important is when we say Blacks and white Jews, are we talking about the same people? What I mean is, were the people in SNCC, were the Jews in SNCC, the same Jews as the rabbis who marched or the American Jewish Committee folks, right? So that when who did more formal things. So in other words, when we say Black-Jewish relations, even forgetting about the race piece, aren't we putting together too many different groups of Black and Jewish people into one basket? And again, both of you talked about that, but again, are Jews who, how should I say this? Are we lumping together people who moved, Jewish, white Jews who moved politically as opposed to religiously? How do we understand those different relationships to Judaism? And the third issue that I want to touch on is the question of whiteness, which again you've all touched on, and therefore white Jews' power as white people, and how those tensions
Thanks, Woof Woof.
manifested themselves again out here. What we know about how do they manifest themselves inside the work. So there were all sorts of tensions, again, between white Jews who were wealthier, who had opportunities that African Americans didn't. There were tensions all the way through in the larger world. So what I would like to pursue is, how did those tensions play out in the civil rights community? Again, we talked a little bit about Israel. We should talk some more. But there were many tensions, I think, that whiteness raised. And my sense is, at least currently, that many white Jews don't like to admit that they're white. And what that means is that they're not taking responsibility for their role in white privilege, their role in white supremacy, essentially, those structures that help white people get advanced. And so if you don't confront those issues, if you don't admit to having to deal with it, then it just gets ignored. And what I'm concerned about, and the reason I want to raise it here, is that if we ignore them now, Jews are not going to be, white Jews are not going to be able to play any effective role in the civil rights movement. So I've laid that out sort of vaguely, and I apologize. But I want to start then by asking you, Cortland, you said that you were aware of people in terms of how they did their work, rather than this person was Jewish, this person was Italian, whatever. But would you say that that was generally true? How do you think Black activists saw their white Jewish colleagues? Did they see them as white people? Did they see them as Jews? Did they see them in some other way? How was their Judaism seen at all?
I mean, I think, first of all, let me just say, most people in the Black community probably don't interact or have never interacted with people in the Jewish community. I mean, so we're now talking about a small segment of people. And I think, in SNCC, which is what I know, I don't know others, differences were noted. And differences were noted not only on the question of whiteness, but there were several layers within the Black community. I faced two of them. The first is that I was born in New York. And so, when I'm in South, somebody might say, you're coming down here as a Northern Negro, right? So, I mean, that was an identity. And even beyond that, within that, Stokely Carmichael, Ivanhoe Downs, and myself, who were all born West Indians, have West Indian heritage, had, they would, it got so that even appeared in the New York Times, the Time magazine, about how we were different because we grew up in an environment where people saw themselves in charge and running things, so that we had a different attitude than people in Black people in the South. So my sense, my sense is that clearly people have differences. Somebody said, well, you're from rural Alabama as opposed to urban Alabama. So so the question about whether you're Jewish or whether you're white, all these things come up and play into play. But the question is, was this a dominant discussion? And my sense is, at some point, the question of whiteness did come up. And the question of whiteness, and I think, let's talk about 1964, was mentioned when, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman got killed. Many people in the South felt that if it were just Cheney, nobody would care. So the question of whiteness came up, and Schwerner's wife was very clear about that. She was so. I think, for me, that's the first time I see the question of whiteness coming up. It's not within the organization, but it's an acknowledgement that if it were not for Schwerner and Goodman, nobody would care about Cheney. So that is one aspect. I think the other thing that's come up is that on the question of whiteness, at some point, people in SNCC who were Black said, the problem of racism isn't in the Black community. It exists in the white community. And therefore, we would really be good if those who understood what was going on, who were white, would go to the white communities and do what's happening. You see that happening now with Black Lives Matter, but we were raising it then. So, I think, though, as far as I can remember, the question of whiteness and the question of Jewishness and so forth came up. People understand the question of who it gets, who gets defined in particular ways. But one of the things I do want to avoid is I don't believe in this, and I really try to avoid telling people about white privilege, because my sense is that there is I see in too many involvements and too many engagements that it is a very disruptive things to the. I mean, I'm at Duke University, and black people are saying, "Well, I'm scared of coming up here because of white privilege and white people." And I'm saying to myself, "What is this stupidness?" You know, I am who. I mean, I'm what Malcolm used to say. I am the man you think you are, and I encourage all black people to have that mindset. I don't. To me, white privilege is nothing. I'm the one that's privileged, and I'm having that mindset. So I'm just saying, it's a long way in terms of answering your question, but I do think again that the question of whiteness and Jewishness really was not a big discussion within SNCC.
Thank you.
Can I say something? Yeah, thank you, Cortland. There are several things that I just want to say very quickly. The one difficult issue, and why I brought up the neoconservatives, is that they're good at spin. So there are terms that get twisted. For instance, the Soviet Union term political correctness, which meant toting the party line, was twisted in the 80s into political correctness here, which is not actually political correctness. It's really about moral correctness. Because in many ways, what's the subtext of their charge is to try to assert that the right political stand to have in the United States is actually white supremacy. The second thing is, you're absolutely right. The privilege discourse is one of those disruptive ones because it's such a butchering of language. Privileges can refer to good things. We have a privilege to be able to address an audience right now, but you don't have a privilege to murder, maim, treat people with disrespect. However, in a country that does not make you accountable, you have a license. And I've argued there's something wrong with white license. White supremacy is about a license to do whatever a white person pleases unto non-white peoples. And the thing about a license, why it's important rather than a privilege, is because you see, if you lock a privilege intrinsically into a people's identity, right? But the privilege is about good things. Are we really to tell people to fight against having good schools, security, food, shelter? If you notice, they're all the things that for a healthy democracy, everybody should have. The issue isn't that white people have privileges. The issue is that these are things being kept from others. But license, if someone gives you a license to do something wrong, you can join the people who don't have the license to get rid of anybody having that license. And what you can fight for that everybody should have or everybody should get rid of, that is political. And so I think your point, Cortland, is right on. One last thing I want to say quickly is, we are talking in the U.S. context, and the U.S. context is constantly changing and twisting its racial language to hide from itself. And if I pick Jewish people as an example, it's hard for many American Jews to understand this, but there are places in which Jewish people's national identity have nothing to do with whiteness. And what I mean like that is, when I was born on an island, Jamaica, from Sephardic and Mizrahi people. Now, because the national identity of Jamaica is black, when you think of a Jamaican, even though Jamaica is a multiracial country, you think of it as black people. So it meant all the Jews I knew in my childhood, you see what I'm getting at, had a black identity, but when they traveled, their racial identity changed. Because my family looked like the screen right now. I have relatives who look like Ira, like Cheryl, and who look like you, Cortland, and me, who are all Jews. You, Cortland. And so I know a Jewish leader in Jamaica right now. You talk to him, black man. When he lands in Boston to go to Jewish meetings, he's a white man. When he goes to another place, he's another. And I've had that experience. I've never called white, but I've been in places where I land as an Arab, and another place where I land is, a Tamil Indian or whatever. And so this is the tricky part, because I'm saying this because I've been answering to save time in the Q&A, some of the written answers. And when we talk about Jews and blackness or Jews and race, we're not really saying it's a fixed thing the way we talk about African Americans. We're talking about what it is in a country that tries to lock you into either you're white or you're everything else. And many Jews have been many everything else. But now there are Jews who are also white, and that is true. And what that means is tricky, because there's one last thing. There was a questioner who was talking about, say, black anti-Semites. But the thing I'd said to that questioner is, one thing you know for fact is black people don't have power in America. I mean, at the end of the day, those tiki torch people talking about Jews will not replace us. We're linked to the president of the United States. And there are white supremacist organizations who bomb, blow up synagogues. That's not black people. And the structure, there are police forces that have Nazi training manuals, as Ira may point out, in Kentucky. So we have to get for real here. It may bruise our feelings. And I know there are black people, for instance, who don't like other black people. There are black people who don't like black Latinos. But they don't have power. So let's just deal with that power issue, is what I would recommend.
Yeah, I'd like to continue in that vein, if I may. I too feel that the term white skin privilege is disruptive. A privilege is a relative thing. It's not an absolute thing. I worked on an assembly line for 24 years. It was not a privilege for me to sell my labor power for a wage, but it was relative in that many African Americans were not hired. Well, in the particular plant that I was, the company was very smart. They hired African Americans in disproportionate numbers because they wanted to keep control. But that's another story. I'm going to share it. But there are problems have their universalities and they have their particularities. Dr. Alvin Toussaint, who was a doctor in Mississippi during the Civil Rights Movement, wrote a pamphlet called The White African Queen Complex. And it dealt with the sexual relationships between white women and African American men in the Civil Rights Movement. This is not the place to go into it, nor do I have an authoritative understanding of it. But you do have to deal with contradictions. I always talk about contradiction having universalities and particularities. We have to discuss that as well. I read a book some time ago. I guess there were two books, but the one that I remember was How Jews Became White Folk. And I would strongly suggest people look at that book, not because you would agree with everything in there, but it gives you a context within which to discuss this. I don't know how better to delve into this better than what Lewis and Cortland did, and maybe Cheryl has insights that I don't have. But this whole business of white skin privilege needs to be discussed in its absolute. I've had a lot of discussions with people who don't agree with me on this and have attacked me for being objectively racist. But I think it has to be contextualized within the framework that Lewis and Cortland talked about. One last thing, if I may. It seems to pale, this discussion, in contrast to the danger in the civil rights movement. You didn't know whether when you wake up you're going to be alive. I was not involved in the South as long as Cortland was. I was involved in the North for several years in the beginning. But we had to survive. In Marion County in Columbia, civil rights workers slept on the floor in a shack because the Klan had fired in. Old Deal says I was not there at the time. I was in another Mississippi place. But we didn't have time these academic, esoteric, polysyllabic with the proper syntax discussions. I'm sorry. We were trying to save our asses and trying to deal with the concrete realities that pertained at that time, that prevailed. So for me, again, I don't know how to approach this any better than what I've said, and certainly Cortland and Lewis, and I'd like to hear Cheryl's view on this as well. But I tell you, people who focus on that, get over that shit.
Well, in a way, we've sort of come full circle back to the point that I was starting with. Let me just say one thing about the white privilege thing. First of all, someone once came up to me and said, I don't consider that I have white privilege. It's not a privilege, it's a right. And the problem is that Black people don't have the same rights. So I loved your word, Lewis, about license. I think that's really a good intervention, as they say. But what I meant by white privilege is that white people acted in certain ways in the movement because they were white, and they were used to doing things. They were used to having control. They were used to being educated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, we've talked about those sorts of tensions. But if you deny, and certainly that is true now, that white people still have a different kind of power in the community, in the world, in the United States at least, than Black people do. And to the extent that white Jews won't admit that they are white to themselves, my question is, will they ask of themselves, what am I doing wrong? Right? How can I approach this struggle differently? So let me just give you one example, and then I'll come back to the question about being alive, because I think that's really central. The best example that I can give of the white privilege of Jews is when I talk about Black Lives Matter in a Jewish setting. And these white Jews will say to me, well, I can't support Black Lives Matter unless they denounce Farrakhan. And I just say to them, essentially, who do you think you are? You don't run Black Lives Matter. If what you're saying is, I don't care enough about civil rights to work with this group unless they do something for me. And once I say that, of course, then they back off and say, oh, no, I'm in support of civil rights. But the fact that these audiences, at least, feel that they have this quid pro quo thing going, that they have the ability to set the terms in an equal way in a movement that is not theirs. That's what I meant by taking your whiteness seriously, in that sort of, you get to say that, right? So that's what I meant, is to challenge white Jews about being sensitive to the ways in which their whiteness gets in the way of the struggle. But that brings me back to your question, Ira, your point about that you never knew when you were going to wake up. One of the things that I encountered over and over again when I was doing my research on Black-Jewish relations in the civil rights movement is that it's a term that in many cases we have put on you activist folks, right, that was not necessarily there at the time, right? As you said, you were too busy staying alive, right? You were too busy trying to get the work done to think in terms of, oh, I trust you because you're Jewish, or oh, whatever, the Black-Jewish relationship, we all care about each other, was not salient at the time. What was at issue was, how do you get the work done, right? And so I want to ask you, Ira, the same kind of question that I just asked Cortland, which is, you spoke a little bit about how you felt in the civil rights, while you were doing the civil rights work, that you felt more political, but also you went back into your Jewish heritage to understand what you were doing there. And I wanted to ask you what you thought in general other white Jewish activists felt. Were they how did they understand themselves as white? Did they understand themselves as Jewish? Did they think about being Jewish? How did they understand their Judaism? I don't know if you can speak to anybody else's position, but if you have a sense.
I'll try, but I want to say that I found the sign I want to show you all, because this does pertain to this. This is a copy of the sign that was put on Vernon Dahmer's home before, 6 months before he was assassinated. Now, did they really want an African-American person to join the Ku Klux Klan? No. But this was the death threat. And Mr. Dahmer said he was not afraid. He would go on.
But he was afraid, but he went on.
Damn right he was afraid. When they surrounded his house, I was told by one of the family members, he grabbed his piece, his weapon, and he drove him off. His wife escaped. His daughter was burned, but she escaped. And Mr. Dahmer was burned over 80% of his body and died two days later. So when I discuss all these academic, esoteric points with the proper syllogistic reasoning, the proper syntax and morphology, and all those other shit that's been in my head for a long time, I always have to look back at this sign. And this sign is still here. Look at what's happened in the last number of years. This shit is rising again. As far as how you proceed from this, I'm going to divert this show and just talk about some of the things that most impressed me about SNCC and how it dealt with it, because they had different opinions. I was approached by a guy named Willie McRae. I don't think he's living anymore, is he? Okay. And he said to me, he says, I have a friend I want you to meet. And they're going to study, they want to study about Judaism, they want to study about Israel and Palestine. And you're Jewish and you're a smart boy, why don't you talk to them? I could not talk to them because I didn't know anything, or more appropriately, I didn't know nothing about this. I just did not know. And I've been reading ever since. It's a lot of years, and I taught a class in this university. But SNCC gave me an opportunity, not just SNCC, but the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, to try to delve into these things. And when Willie McRae had this guy ask me about Vietnam, and I didn't know, I was just so embarrassed. I just didn't know. That's the way I have to deal with it. So I'm not answering your question directly, Cheryl. I'm simply saying that this is all has to be contextualized. It's all of a piece. And how to proceed from here, I'll be damned if I know.
In a way, you are both answering the question. And in fact, so did you, Louis, when you pointed out that you're all speaking from a leftist political position, that your motivations are progressive. And it seems to me, at least, that to call things, the special bond between blacks and Jews, again, white Jews, is to put too much emphasis on the religious piece and not enough emphasis on the political piece. And so it sounds to me like what you're all suggesting is that the politics of the person that you're working with was much more important than the self-identity in the sense of Jewish or not Jewish. Do you think that that's true, that what we call the black-Jewish relationship might more properly be called the black progressive Jewish relationship?
I'll start. There were different Jews, like there are different to everybody's. I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, and we moved one step up on the socioeconomic scale to a city housing project. that's a long story too. It involved Donald Trump's father. Screw everybody. But anyhow.
I'm shocked to hear that.
Yeah, and in Chicago, there was a wonderful rabbi. I think his name was Rabbi Wolf. And I knew somebody from the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs who talked to me about him. These were Jews who were very active in the civil rights movement, but they were very wealthy. And so I can't talk about Jews of a piece. It's Jews and how they relate to the socioeconomic surroundings that they countenance. That's the best I can do. I'm sorry, Cheryl, I can't go further on that.
Absolutely. But in a way, that is, again, an answer. Cortland, I'm sorry.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just saying, yeah. No, I mean, Rabbi Wolf was my wife's rabbi, by the way. And yeah, she absolutely loved him. He was a wonderful man. He was also one of my students' rabbi when I was at Yale. And yeah, he's one of these people where just a human being he was. It's almost difficult for people to talk about him without tears coming to their eyes. And it's because he was just so loving. And, but the political part, I was thinking what Cortland said also about New York, because even though I talked earlier about where I was born, as a child, I grew up in New York. And so even though my background was not, say, the Yiddish background, everybody who grows up in New York ends up speaking some degree of Yiddish. And so, but the thing is, you're absolutely right, Cheryl. It's about the question of political responsibility. And there was one questioner earlier who was bringing up Tikkun Olam. Even though we put it in a religious context, it's pretty obvious the ending of my opening remarks is about Tikkun Olam. Okay? That ultimately, when at the end of the day, the obligation that we're trying to present even though it's presented as an ethical obligation, the question of political responsibility is always for an entire country, an entire people, or the globe. If you're an environmentalist, or if you're a global humanist, it's for the globe. And that is, even though we bring it up in a lot of black and white things, what some of us don't realize is that, and I'm speaking as a black Jew, and it's funny, I'm just saying it because I'm in the U.S. context. I hate the term saying white Jew, black Jew, but it's contextual. But I remember, but there's a lot of political work I've done, and in academic contexts, I don't talk about them often, mainly because there's a way in which I'm critical of academics who commodify their political identity, you see. But I could tell a story about, there's a period where I was doing a lot of political work, and here I am, this Jewish guy, black Jewish guy, but this is dealing with black activism. And there was a moment, there was a group I was working with in New Haven where a lot of the issues we're talking about right now are faced, because the other brothers, who we say, and sisters, even though we're all technically black, some were Muslim, some were people who were incarcerated and just came out, some were people who were Christian, some were secular, some were not religious. And even when I talk, my attitude wasn't, even though a group is, Jewish, wasn't like as a religious identity, because a lot of American Jews don't know that Jews in the rest of the world actually look at Jewish people in racial ethnic terms, not religious terms. That's a very European, North American thing. And so and the thing that's hard for many Americans to understand too is it is possible to be more than one race at the same time. That's a whole other can of worms. But my point is that there's certain points at which, when you're in struggle, your differences also come out. And there's a point at which you have to make a decision. And that struggle I'm talking about was one in which we were trying to deal with severe conflicts in a community that meant we had to go into parks and deal with people who could kill us. And at that moment, we had to walk in with a commitment. And I think it's a sum of what Ira and Cortland were talking about understanding that they were fighting for something greater than ourselves. You see? And I think that's what Tikkun Olam, but also what political responsibility is about. And so thank you for bringing up that nuance.
No, actually, thank you. I want to come back to this question about Tikkun Olam because it does bring us back to the question about in what ways Jews got involved with the civil rights movement, in what ways do they understand their involvement. When I was growing up, to support the civil rights movement was to be Jewish, right? It was as much tzedakah, charity, to give to the NAACP as it was to the Jewish National Fund or whatever it was. But that has not always been true. So I believe my Jewish identity is wrapped up in these issues. But there weren't any Jews in the abolitionist movement, right? There has not always historically been a Jewish presence on the progressive side of things. So my understanding of what it means to be Jewish is a very different thing from other people. As again, all of you know, many Jews got involved in the civil rights movement, but the more religious you were, the less likely it was that you were going to be in. There were very few Orthodox Jews engaged in civil rights work. So all I'm saying is that I think there are different understandings of what it means to be Jewish, and that people that see this as a Tikkun Olam thing are a particular kind of have a particular kind of Jewish identity, and I guess that's what I mean. And that brings me back to what you were talking about, Cortland, about the Jews in the National Lawyers Guild, etc., which is, on the one hand, you said I didn't know what anybody was, that wasn't important, and yet you were able to identify all the Jews. Could you have identified all the Methodists, for example? In other words, is there something specific about Jewish identity that was important and significant?
I mean, I think the thing
we're not going to be able to get to that question. We have a hard deadline because of our ASL interpreters and the closed captioners.
Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry.
No, don't worry. I didn't want to interrupt because, conversation was critical and going in the right direction. Anyways, I just want to thank everyone who made this event possible, our panelists, the interpreters, the captioners, our JEED organizers, the volunteers, the students, JFRED, Jewish Currents, and everyone who, came to listen and participate. If you want to help us continue hosting events like these, please consider making a small donation. We threw the link into the chat. And I think we're going to have to end it there, but thank you everyone for showing up.
Good night.
Thank you all.
Keep safe and healthy and find joy. Remember your humanity.
All right, that meeting's been ended. What does this say? I have another meeting, but I'm going to end this, okay? Portland City Council is weighing whether to expand its non-police team for mental health and homeless. All right. I'm going to, let's see if they're if this is streaming online. Where is this? 5:30 to 7. All right.